so we can share this with others. I imagine you'll have to accept that if you want to continue on this journey. So again, I'm Jeff Eddings. I won't go through the whole intro again, but I am a Presbyterian pastor. Started Hot Metal Bridge Faith Community in 2004. Served there till 2019. And since I left Hot Metal Bridge, I've been working for the Presbyterian Mission Agency. I am the spiritual and spiritual formation and coaching associate of the 1,001 New Worshiping Communities movements of the Presbyterian Mission Agency. I've been doing that for the last couple of years, working with church planners all around the country, overseeing a network of coaches that work with those planners and offering various spiritual formation opportunities, such as this series, to our leaders and to others. What some important spiritual practices for me that help me with my own spiritual fortitude is contemplative spirituality. Silence and solitude and stillness are important parts of my journey. I've worked with the Shalem Institute around leading contemplative prayer retreats and groups, and recently worked with the Pneuma Institute here in Pittsburgh to be certified in leading the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius in daily life. Those are important things to me. So we're glad you're here. I'm so glad that you've decided to join this seminar series. And I'm really grateful for Brian McLaren and his willingness to join us. Brian, I'm sure, needs a lot less introduction than myself, but I feel fortunate that I got to know Brian a little bit back when Hot Metal was just beginning. Got to attend a couple pastor retreats that he was leading. And just, although we all know Brian from his books and his blogs and his speaking engagements, what impressed me most back then and still does today is he has a pastoral heart. And his heart is about caring for others and opening up the gospel to all people. And so Brian, I'd love for you to just say a little hello to folks. Remind us what you were pre Brian McLaren, and also maybe tell us a little bit, what were you doing? What have you been up to in COVID space?
Sure. Well, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everybody. Great to see you all. I am coming to you today in Southern California. I'm at the home of a friend. I'm speaking here tomorrow. And I'm on the land, the ancestral lands of the Juaneño people here on the California coast. But I live in Southwest Florida, a little place called Marco Island at the edge of the Everglades, which is the ancestral lands of the Calusa and the Muspa, and then Paleo Indians whose names we do not know. Before I started writing, or when I started writing, I was a pastor and a church planter. So that makes me especially glad to be with this community of people. I helped plant a church in, boy, this sounds like ancient history, but in 1982, it could just as well be 1882. And so in 1982, and I was the pastor of that church for 24 years. And so your people like you and your work, super close to my heart. All through those years, I had the pleasure of spending time with a lot of other church planners. And then maybe the only other thing I'll say is that before I started pastoring, church planting and pastoring, I was a college English teacher.
Oh, wow. That's great. And what have you been doing in the COVID space?
So not traveling, which, my life has been so much traveling, and I have all kinds of mixed feelings about traveling, especially because of, carbon footprint and so on. But so it has been great to be home, and I'm just doing a bit of travel this fall. But one kind of special, I'll tell you two little special things about COVID for me. Being home in Southwest Florida, one of my daughters and her husband and their kids were all schooling and working remotely. So they came and spent 5 months with us during COVID. So to have all 3 grandkids around every day was really a superb treat. And then, I love being outdoors. So being home means walks and enjoying the natural world around me.
Great. Thanks, Brian. One last person I would like to introduce, or have her introduce herself, and that is Molly Atkinson, my colleague at 1001, and she's helping out. She's co-hosting. She'll be dropping some things in the chat. Say hello, Molly, please.
Hi all, my name is Molly Atkinson and I am coming to you from Louisville, Kentucky. And I have worked with 1001, I think for almost 2 years now. I mostly work with Jeff and Michael Gerling, who is the assessments, the Discerning Missional Leadership Assessments associate. And so I work closely with both of them and then the rest of the 1001 team. And I'm pleased to be here and to be helping out.
Thanks, Molly. So a little ground rules, just kind of like for as we proceed here, how I see the next hour and a half or so that we'll spend together is that Brian and I are going to engage around a conversation around this idea of the way of spiritual fortitude and caring for ourselves. And Molly will occasionally be dropping some like survey type questions into the chat that I'd love for you to respond to with either a word or two, or sometimes it's just going to be a number I'm asking you to kind of put up there. But save kind of your interaction around questions you might have or other thoughts more towards the end. We're going to open up then for you to kind of throw some questions and thoughts into the chat so we can respond to them. But my first question for you to respond to in the chat as we begin our time is just what has brought you to this space? Why this seminar? What are you looking for in the course of these few weeks? And either a word or a phrase or however you want to answer that would be great. And as you're beginning to think about that and throw your answers in the chat, I do want to start our time and frame it with a few minutes of just contemplative prayer space and a couple minutes of silence. I have a metaphor for us, Brian, for this journey. And the metaphor, I'm kind of taking it from a book by Martin Laird called An Ocean of Light. And Martin Laird wrote 3 wonderful books about contemplative prayer space. And in the one, An Ocean of Light, he talks about us as mountain. His metaphor is that we are mountain. And everything that happens, all the circumstances, all the situations in our life, he equates to just weather on the mountain. That if we really understand ourselves as rooted, as beloved, as stardust, as dust, as a mountain, everything that happens is weather. And he says this: we are the mountain and not the weather that appears on the mountain. Whether storms or sunshine, the mountain accepts without judgment whatever weather is weathering. In fact, the mountain has no opinion on what weather is weathering. Such is the non-clinging of the mountain's ancient wisdom. Certainly clouds and storms will regather and disperse again and again, but the wisdom of the mountain knows that the sun shines fully, no matter the presence or absence of cloud, mist, fog, gloom, or storm. The wisdom of the mountain knows that when dark clouds return to cover the sun, we now realize with calm assurance that the sun continues to shine as splendidly as ever. For the sun can do but one thing: shine. So friends, I invite you to just put down whatever you're holding right at this moment, whether it's something physical, something emotional, something spiritual, and I invite you to be still. Let us be still for 2 minutes together, reflect on our own mountainness, and remember that we are God's beloved. Let's pray for a moment. Holy and gracious God, we give you thanks for this day that you have given us and your spirit, which is already present within us. We don't need to invite it into this space. It is in this space. It is within us. But may we be attentive to that spirit as we share in this space and this time together. Amen. So question for you, friends, that also to maybe drop something in the chat about is, what is the weather like on your mountain right now? What is the weather like on your mountain right now? And Brian, that's kind of where I want to start a little bit in our conversation, kind of like assessing the state of the weather on the mountain. We don't need to highlight these things, but I will, just to like highlight the anxiety levels that are in a lot of our pastors and the stressed space that they're coming out of. Obviously, we're in a pandemic. We've got environmental crisis happening. We've got division happening in our politics, in our country, in our churches. And that doesn't begin to assess also everybody's personal space, whatever personal anxieties or illnesses or struggles that they're having. And if you're a PCUSA pastor, you're invited to the Matthew 25 initiatives to dismantle structural racism and eradicate poverty. And so that's all we have to do as we hold all this space together. And just yesterday, I think it was, a survey came out from PCUSA Research Services about pastoral fatigue. And it found that out of the participants, 49% feel fatigue every day. 13% say they're worn out most of the time. 35% feel like they're burnt out. 32 feel isolated. 1/3 do not even take any kind of regular day off. And only 34 have taken a sabbatical. And that whole survey happened pre-COVID. So that was just before COVID set in. So I can't imagine, I imagine those numbers are spiked, are higher now. And the COVID has obviously made all those things a lot worse. So friends, for those of you that are here, the other survey right now is just, what's your stress level? On a 1 to 10, where do you find yourself in terms of anxiety and stress? And the last thing, Brian, is that pastors are not very good at caring for themselves, right? That's the other struggle. Pastors don't have great boundaries, and the word burnout comes up a lot in our kind of workspace. So where have you been seeing this, Brian, and you know, from your own experience, where have you experienced that?
Yeah, Jeff, a story comes to mind. Maybe I could share briefly, but this comes from the years when I was planting a church. And what would typically happen is I would work so many hours, and as all of you know, no matter how many hours you work, your inbox is not empty, and there's 10 things you still haven't done, and because of that, I wouldn't take time for exercise, and I would gain weight. And when I'd feel really guilty about my weight, then I would force myself to start running. And there was a lake where I used to run around, and I would, but even when I was running to try to get a little bit of exercise, do you all remember a Walkman? I guess what we had before these things. But I had a Walkman, and I was playing cassette tapes with earphones in my ear as I ran. And the person on this lecture quoted Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln said something like, "I have tried to conduct myself while I'm in this office so that even if I lose every friend on earth while I'm in this office, I will still have a friend down inside of me." And I don't think I can communicate this, but maybe you can imagine it. Here I'm running, and my lungs are telling me to stop running, and my legs are telling me to stop running, trying to keep running. And all of a sudden, this wave of emotion comes over me at that phrase, "a friend to myself." And I start sobbing. And I bend over, I'm leaning on my knee, with my hands on my knees on this trail around this lake. and I'm sobbing. And all I'm hearing inside myself is like this coup d'etat of these voices in my head saying, you are not a friend to yourself. Somebody else is tired, you tell them to take a rest. You never let yourself take a rest. Somebody else makes a mistake, you say, don't think about it twice. But if you make a mistake, you beat yourself up for it for days. And I just sat there. I was scared, like, is this the beginning like of a major breakdown? But all I felt was, I am not a friend to myself. And that day, I remember the message I came home with is, if I'm going to survive, I have to find out how to be a friend to myself. And that to me is I think a moment, maybe some people don't need it, but I needed that moment. And then I'll add one other quick thing by way of anecdote. It wasn't too long after that one of my sons, who was then 6.5 years old, was diagnosed with cancer. And the elders of our little church, a couple of them came over. Literally, this is a day or two after the diagnosis, and we were just, traumatized and devastated. And thanks be to God, he survived. But he had a 70% chances of survival, which didn't sound very good, at that point. And I'll never forget my elder sitting in my living room and said to me, Brian, your job now is to be there for your son and be there for your wife and be there for your kids. Your job is to do as little as possible for this church. If you do not take time away from this church, you will be hurting this church as well as your family and yourself. And they were firm. They were just very, very firm. You put those two things together, and it confronted me with how, ministry can be a workaholic kind of experience, and it shouldn't be. Yeah. So I'm deeply empathetic for people who feel, the stress. Yeah.
And what a gift that is to you, to have a community that was that strong about the boundary that you needed to create. Because I know that in the work and conversation I have with a lot of our pastors, that sometimes it's just the demands, the expectations, the anxiety of the community like pours onto the pastor, and they kind of anticipate or expect them to constantly be like available, and just upping the stress. And just looking at the numbers here, there's a lot of 7s and 8s and 9s, and there's one, Judith, who's not serving a church right now. So, and some others that, on the weather level, like there's shiny moments. Of course, there's sunshine and clouds, but there's kind of an overwhelming feeling of, I just think, heaviness. And so the question for you, Brian, is how were you a friend to yourself in that space? Were there some things that like you noticed that you changed or did? And just for the chat, I'm curious, another number survey, how do you feel you do in caring for yourself, friends, on a self-care level, 1 to 10, 10 being like, I'm doing great. So go ahead, Brian, what are your thoughts?
That's a great question. Well, there's so much we could say about this, Jeff, but I'll tell you something that really pulled me through during that time. I had a mentor. He was about 20 years older than me. He just passed away last year. But around that time, he said to me, most pastors I know are unhealthy people because they have no non-utilitarian relationships. That was his term. Every relationship they have is either someone they're ministering to, someone they're evangelizing, somebody, and all of their relationships have a utilitarian dimension to them. And he said, to be a healthy human being, you need people who you're around because you like them and they like you. And nobody makes money off of it, and nobody is successful or unsuccessful around it. And one of the blessings of my life is having, always been able to find a couple of friends like that. Occasionally inside the church, but usually it felt important to find people outside the church. And for me to care about their success. One of the one of the toxic things that happens in ministry is you're so dedicated to the church, but the church is a reflection of your success. So your dedication to the church can subtly be a dedication to your own success, and you don't care that much about other people's success. And so to have people who I like and I want to care about their success, it takes me out of myself. It makes my world a little bit bigger. And then to have friends who care about my success and don't have anything to gain about it. One of those friends, we met every month, almost every month. We miss occasionally, but for many years. And we would sit down at a restaurant, and our first two questions were always the same. First was, how goes it with your soul? And second was, how goes the battle? So that first question gave us the chance. It wasn't an accountability group where we have to be honest. It was like, I get the chance to be honest with somebody. And oh my gosh, those non-utilitarian relationships sure meant a lot to me.
Yeah, I remember having that same revelation in the early years of hot metal. That, you know, when you start something from scratch, it's like, it's so personal, and you think everything is the most important thing in the world, and every relationship's the most important relationship in the world. And we were a few years in, and my wife and I realized we had kind of neglected some of our important relationships, folks that had been so valuable to us, and we were only seeing once a year, and we felt it in our system and in our life. And we had to reorient ourselves to get back to those non-utilitarian, like, important friendships that I'm gone from hot metal now, but those friendships still exist, and they were there beforehand, and they will continue on, you know, through our life. So I think that's a great insight.
Yeah, I think one way to say it is that being a friend to myself meant that I had to be sure I surrounded myself with some good friends. And you know, this might sound a little crass, so forgive me in advance. But, you know, if you were to think of the people who are in your schedule from week to week, and you would say some of these people are very draining people, very difficult people. Some of these people are very encouraging people. I think one of the ways I also, as a friend to myself, is by realizing if I've been around a certain number of draining people in the last week, and that I have to make sure I get around some encouraging people. And part of that means understanding, to the degree that you have any control over your own schedule, that you schedule time with some of those people who are non-utilitarian relationships. And if they are, you know, obviously in church relationships, that you make sure you're around some of those people who leave you feeling fuller than you were before.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, as I reflected on, like, what it means, like, this current state of our pastors and what it means to, like, care for ourselves, I wanted to come up with something other than, like, the idea of, like, self-care. Self-care is a great idea, but doesn't always, like, kind of compel us. So that's why I thought of this. Well, what does it mean to develop in us kind of an attribute that anchors us, right?
Yes.
So that's why I thought of this, the way of spiritual fortitude, and came up with this little definition, that the spiritual fortitude, the way of spiritual fortitude, Molly, if you could drop this in there. This is my definition, and then you can riff on it and add to it as you see fit. But, like, the mental, emotional, and spiritual strength to bear pain and encounter adversity or temptation with courage by nurturing resilient spiritual practices where we learn to love ourselves, that we may then love and care for others.
You know, there's something about that, Jeff, that I really like, and it's interesting that you dropped that love ourselves in. And one way to think about this is, if God is in all things, and if God is in us, what of God within us is trying to love us? And to remind us that we exist as people. We're not just here as functionaries of the church. We're not just here as servants of a congregation. And that we actually matter too. Y'all would probably most of you know who Rob Bell is, and Rob used to say to pastors, you need to smoke what you're selling. Now, some of you that might make way too much sense, but here's what he meant. He meant if we're preaching about the abundant life for other people, we had better make sure that we're taking care that we're actually experiencing the abundant life too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that some of these practices, very often what happens is we think, I've got to spend more time in prayer. And we think of all these kind of spiritual things that, in a sense, add to our to-do list. Now, I'm all for those things if we want to do them. But I think we have to start to understand friendship to ourselves, not as an act of law, but as an act of grace. And in a sense, some part of us joining God as God loves us and cares for us.
Yeah. I listen. Are you familiar with the podcast Hidden Brain?
Yes.
It's a wonderful podcast, and one of the most recent ones was entitled "Be Kind to Yourself." Yes. I really encourage everybody to possibly listen to it. But it talked about that. It talked about like when we take time to have self-compassion, it is what gives us capacity to have compassion on others. And that we need to start with that space of grace, offering grace to ourselves, the same grace that we often would offer to others. And I think that's what, like, when I think of like, what's a resilient spiritual practice? I think it's one that has to like kind of ground us in our belovedness and help us understand what it means to offer grace to ourselves and to others. And there's so many ways that I think we can like step into that. But to go off that abundant life observation, this is where I want us to, let's chat about Jesus. Let's bring Jesus into this conversation, because well, there's obviously Jesus is our model. Jesus as Christians is the one we aspire to follow. And there's kind of a tension. There's a tension in the following. First, there's this call to discipleship, right? And I'd love to hear from folks in the chat, like what, when you hear discipleship, like what are other words that you associate with that? What do you think of when you think of discipleship? So there's this Jesus with a very clear calling to discipleship, and when I think of that, sometimes I think of some of the language you use around pick up your cross, follow me, lay down your life, and there's times when it sounds like he's saying leave everybody and leave everything, right? That can be like an arc of discipleship. But at the same time, from Jesus, we have this, like you said, invitation to abundant life, and an invitation like to rest. And so it feels like a tension to me. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that tension in our following Jesus.
Well, Jeff, one of the things that comes to my mind is one of our problems is that we hear too many preachers who select certain parts of the Gospels and leave out other parts, right? So yes, Jesus is, there are parts of the Gospels where Jesus's relatives are worried about his mental health. Let's all notice this, right? They're thinking the guy has lost his mind. He's broken. He's crazy, because people are with him from morning to night. And he even gets a little defensive when they come looking for him, So there are times when, if I'm really honest, Jesus looks like he's in the red zone too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the whole fig tree thing is him just being like off the edge, like, I'm sick of this, cursing this fig tree.
That's right. But there are other times where Jesus is like, I heard someone say, there are times when Jesus is the person with the least amount of messianic complex you can imagine, because everybody's looking for him and he's out being alone. He's out in solitude. I think a huge part of solitude for people in our line of work is to get away from the expectations of others. because I think especially those of us, it probably varies by Myers-Briggs type and Enneagram type, but I think many of us are like vacuum cleaners, and we suck up people's expectations, and we suck up their disapproval, and we suck up their needs, and we feel this obligation to meet every need. And you can just see Jesus getting away from people, and they're frustrated with him. Where is he? We want more bread. Where is this guy? And he just seems like he doesn't care. He needs to take care of himself and get away. So one of the things I see from Jesus is actually permission to be very human. And that's why that image of a mountain is great, to say, there are seasons where life is really hard. And then there are other seasons where you intentionally say, I'm getting the heck out of Dodge to get out into the wilderness and be away from all these expectations and be good to myself and take care of myself. So, I see that there in the Gospels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love it's Mark chapter 1, 35, where it says like he got up early in the morning and went out to pray in the dark, which I always love to reference. But like right after that is the disciples going, where'd he go? And Peter finding him and saying like, everybody's looking for you. And Jesus kind of being like, yeah, I needed some space. I needed some space, man. And I think like pastors, we get like that expectation thing, Brian, I think is spot on. Like expectations that congregants and people we serve have of us, but also I recognize like expectations I was putting on everybody else, which was also heightening my anxiety and stress when everybody wasn't responding the way that I wanted them to respond. And in our conversation you and I had earlier, I think you talked a little bit around the metaphor of the pastor-congregation relationship, around like the marriage system.
Yeah.
Is that kind of work in here? Could you speak to that?
First, let me just say something that comes to mind at this moment, Jeff. One of the ways we could, let me say it this way to all of you. If I were as your friend, I wish I could be each of your personal friend. As your friend, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to go to your elder board or whatever it's called, session, whatever it's called. And I'd like to say to them, listen, you need to take care of Susan and Marcy and Debbie and Arlene and Bob and Eileen and Martha and Pamela and Ray. You need to take care of these people. And one of the ways you need to take care of them is give them a maximum number of hours you want them to work for this church.
Amen.
And when I went through that thing that I shared with you, and my elders told me I had to work as few hours as possible while my family needed me, I came back to when we were sort of through the crisis, I came back to my staff and I said, I would like you all to work 40 to 48 hours per week. 40 is a good basic, but I don't want you working any more than 48. If you're working more than, I said, and the only reason I'm picking 48 is because there are a lot of people in the church who work a 40-hour-a-week job and they put in 8 hours as volunteers. I said, but the truth is, you might be better off taking those 8 hours and being a volunteer in some other organization, but don't make it more than 48. And you have to promise me, in fact, this is when they had to turn in timesheets and stuff, we kept track of it. And we had to work out plans for comp time. If they had a good reason to be working more hours, they'd have to take comp time. And I just say that because that becomes a practical way of saying, I'm going to be a friend of myself, and I'm going to go talk to my board, and we're going to come up with some sort of agreement like that. And if it helps, play him this video.
I mean that's Brian McLaren just declared pastors shouldn't work more than 40 hours. Take that to your sessions or whoever you need to take that to. And that like points to the abundant life, right?
Yes.
That points to a life that's filled with more than just what you're trying to offer to your congregation. And let's put that in the chat, friends. Like what's your definition of discipleship? What's your definition of abundant life? Where do you find abundant life? What do you think of when we say the words abundant life? Because this is what Jesus calls us to. He doesn't call us to this burnout space. And I think we get caught a lot, Brian, in this space of like feeling we need to do all the things before we be. Like that's a big emphasis on some of the conversations I have with pastors and spiritual leaders, is like, how are you practicing being before you practice the doing?
If I could make that a tiny bit more, I don't know, specific, Jeff, it might be, how can you be yourself? Because so this is where our idiosyncrasies, I think, are really part of the gift of who we are and the uniqueness of our God created selves, So to say, look, you're a baseball fan, and for you to get and see some baseball games live is a life-giving thing for you. And you owe it to yourself to let yourself be yourself and love baseball. And for me, it might be fly fishing. And for somebody else, it might be going to a knitting conference where you get to meet a bunch of other knitters. And for somebody else, it might be, doing some extreme sport, rock climbing, whatever it is. But everybody had for some people, it's reading. I have a dear friend, a nun, and she got a sabbatical. And I said, "What did you do on your sabbatical?" She said, "I read trashy detective novels." And I just thought, the universe rejoices and God is happy that she got to read trashy detective novels. But that, to me, being yourself is part of this, and to let ministry eat away what makes you, I don't think is good for anybody. Jeff, I wonder if I could go back to, and you had brought up the issue of marriage. Do you want to say some more about that?
No, I wondered if that was because we talked about that in one of our conversations leading up to this as a metaphor. I can't remember exactly how you were using it. So if it's not relevant to where we are right now, that's fine. I'm fine with kind of moving on to like just kind of continue to unpack like what a resilient spiritual practice is. And maybe like, are there certain practices, like there's so much about Jesus we don't see in the Gospels, because mostly it's following him around as he's working, right? Like there's a lot of space, I think, in between that we miss out on in terms of him just like traveling with disciples in between towns, or like space that they may have been taking. But any reflections on kind of like what other resilient spiritual practices Jesus might suggest for us, or other practices in your own life?
We only get a couple windows, like those times when he gets up early to go and pray. And again, I think we guilt-oriented, very zealous and responsible Christians, we hear about Jesus getting up early to pray and we think, oh no, that's something else I fail at. And I don't see it that way. I see it as like Jesus thought, I got a lot to do today. I've got a lot of people I got to be around. I just got to get some time alone. And it would mean more to me to get up than to sleep in. And like, it's not like God is going to be really disappointed with me if I don't make time for God. Like it's a guilt thing, I think it's much more like he assessed what he needed. And there were other times where he worked from morning to night and his relatives were worried about him, but he felt like, no, this is, I'm getting energized by this. This is like food and drink to me to do this. This isn't draining me. This is filling me. So one of his practices, I think, and we see it when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. He says, my soul is, how does he say it? My soul is stressed unto death or something, I forget the exact words, but my heart is at the breaking point. And for us to be able to develop the habit of saying, how am I doing? To finish a meeting and say, that meeting took life out of me. I am damaged by that meeting. I need to acknowledge that. I need to think, what's going to help me recharge from that meeting? Or to say, whenever I'm with him, that charges me up. And I'm going to make sure that, I take some time to be with that person who's very encouraging. That's to me, it helps us be resilient.
I mean, it kind of makes me think of Jesus taking Peter, James, and John aside, like a little bit of like there's just special space there who are those
Yeah.
folks that we kind of gather in that way. But I also
Yeah.
always reflect on the idea that like Jesus was in a very intense ministry arc, right? A
Yes.
3-year intense ministry
Yeah.
arc, where many of us are trying to be in this for the very long haul,
That's right.
That like we're hopefully in this for the decades, and
Yes.
not just the 3 years. So sometimes I think offering ourselves that kind of grace, like you
My
can't
gosh.
always compare yourself to Jesus, because that was a 3-year of intensity. And sometimes we all go through those spaces of like, wow, this is an intense ministry period. But like to your point, when do we then say, wow, life has been sucked out of me? How do I prepare for what's next? What space do I need to inhabit now?
You know, a few years ago, I reached, well, because of my schedule, then I had speaking commitments about 18 months out into the future, and it had been that way for probably 10 or 12 years. And the way I said it is, if I put my foot on the brake, I don't stop for 18 months. And so I had to really monitor my energy level, and I got worn out, and and so 18 months in advance, I gave myself a 10-month sabbatical with no travel. And my very last speaking engagement before that sabbatical, I stopped to see a friend, another kind of soul friend and spiritual friend, non-utilitarian relationship. And, you know, how are you doing? He says, and I tell him, something's wrong with me. I said, I feel like I'm thinking in molasses. In other words, my brain is tired. Everything's slowed down. I'm having trouble finishing sentences. And he says, Brian, you wouldn't believe it, but I just went to a psychologist who referred me to a neurologist because I was feeling the same way. And then he said the neurologist did a brain scan on me and said that the parts of the brain that are devoted to problem solving and creativity were lit up in my brain. And he said, the neurologist said to him, I'm surprised somebody like you isn't hospitalized because your brain is so abnormally stimulated. And so that when we become aware, like this is not just a matter of how good self-care we are, it's a matter of our bodies, our physical organism needing to be cared for. We wouldn't put that much stress on our dog or cat, you know. We would ride a horse into the ground. And so even to have compassion on our physical bodies.
Yeah. And you said the word Sabbath. And let's like stop and reflect on that for a minute, because that's a commandment. That made the top 10, you know? And we don't do that well. We have like filled up our schedules and our lives, zero margins, right? We've not created margins. That survey, 1/3 of pastors don't take any day. And it said no, a day off, like from ministry and from chores, apparently was how it was worded. Like not just a day where I'm not thinking about ministry, but now I'm catching up with everything else that's in my life. Like a true day of Sabbath. I think that is like, I think it was Walter Brueggemann wrote a book, Sabbath as Resistance. And like the willingness to stop, the willingness to rest, a true discipline of creating that space for ourselves can be really life-giving and anchoring. But we just kind of refuse to give ourselves permission to do it.
So Jeff, could I ask a question for the chat on this one?
Yes,
so one of my struggles in my years as a pastor is if I'm going to take a day off, what day is it going to be? Saturday never worked for me because I always felt the pressure of Sunday. Plus, it was a day where I had a lot of family responsibilities. A lot of people took Monday off, but I was always so exhausted from everything on Sunday. And in some ways, I always also had a lot of motivation to follow up on things from Sunday that Monday never worked. So my best day off ended up being Thursday, but I wondered what day. I'm just curious. Some people, maybe Monday's the perfect day. Other people, Saturday. I'd love to hear what people say about that.
Yeah. and be honest, if you don't take a day off, you can put that in there too. Yeah, Friday, it was Friday for me, Brian. I always found Friday because I felt like Friday at least gave me the option for a 2-day weekend, like Friday into Saturday.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like family things, of course, and Saturday, night, you're always kind of watching the watch and going like, I got to get home and get in bed.
Yes, that's right.
But it still felt at least like a little bit more space. And I know for me, leaving a pastoral role and no longer having, after 30 years of Sunday obligations, to no longer have a Sunday obligation was like mind blowing.
Yes.
And I get why like a lot of people coming out of pandemic aren't necessarily going back to church, because maybe they're finding some different rhythms and some different space.
Yes. And someone mentioned, if you're caring for kids or aging parents, that makes it hard to take a day off. And I think that's also important to remember too. There are times when, when what we might want is just impossible. But even then we have to think this won't last forever. I was just sharing with someone today, I spent 7 of the last 10 years as the primary caretaker for first my father, then my mother. And that was a period of added stress that was unavoidable. And it's over, and I have no regrets for the time I spent caring for them. But I also remember it was not easy.
And just to acknowledge that there are definitely different spaces in life and time in life when it's easier to find that space for yourself, and other times when it's really truly difficult. And sometimes it's a privilege to be able to take space, and others might not have those opportunities. But I think there are ways that we can be kind to ourselves, be a friend to ourselves. And when we find that things are like overly stressful from our community, how do we, reaching out to mentors, reaching out to leaders that can help us navigate those spaces. I know for a lot of our immigrant leaders in the new worshiping community, 1001 movement, that sometimes it's hard for them. Their communities have a lot of demands. There's a lot that's happening. There's a lot of expectations on them. And I had one of my African pastors who did a 2-day retreat, a virtual 2-day retreat. And he has a young family. He's got a very demanding community. And he took 2 days. He went away and I spent some time with him on Zoom as part of that retreat. And at the end of it, like, he was so grateful for it. And he said 2 days felt like 2 months. And it was like, it was enough for him to say, like, I'm ready to step back in. So I think it's just giving ourselves permission to know that if we step out for a little while, our communities are going to be okay. Yeah, it's going to be okay. We're not always as important as we might, think we are.
Actually, I'll just throw a little freebie out here for folks, but especially if you're a founding pastor, I would highly recommend sometime when you could take a half hour, 45 minutes, Google the term founder syndrome, and just find articles on founder syndrome, because if you succeed, you will be a founder. And one of the great problems of almost any organization with the founder is that when the founder leaves, it's traumatic for the founder and traumatic for the organization. And very often the founders don't leave when they should, because their ego is so fused with the organization. They can't imagine surviving without the organization, and they don't think the organization will survive without them. And that's another reason to actually have a life and not let our work become our life. A lot of folks might remember a wonderful writer and a dear friend and mentor to me, Dallas Willard. And Dallas had a little diagram he drew, and I'm going to sort of give a visual of it here, but it was kind of like an egg. So you got a big circle, and then inside of that is a smaller circle, and inside of that is a smaller circle. The big circle, he said, is your life. The next circle
Mm.
is your job. I'm sorry, is your ministry. And the smallest circle is your job. And the way you said it is, your job is what you get paid for. But almost all of us have a ministry that's bigger than our job. In other words, there are things we care about that we like to do that we don't get paid for. But he said, all of the rest of that circle is your life. And that's your marriage. And if you have children, and your friendships, and your hobbies, and your interests, and those things that make you you. And here's what he said: for a lot of us in church work, our job takes over our ministry, and then our job takes over our life. And if you live that way, I can promise you this: if you live that way, it will be bad for your church, because you're over functioning in the system. So that's not only bad for you and the people who love you, it's actually bad for the church to have an over functioning pastor. So anyhow, for what it's worth, I could help.
No, that's really good. And it reminds me of about 7 years ago, after I was about 10 years into my pastoring at Hot Metal, I was fortunate enough to be able to take a 4-month sabbatical. And not too long into that sabbatical, as I was kind of sitting in, I don't know, I think I was sitting in some sort of prayer space or attitude. I was, the only book of the Bible I was reading was Ecclesiastes at the time. So it just kind of shows you where I was mentally, emotionally. But I just remember having a thought, like, it was like God whispering to me, like, hey, Jeff, you're not that important. And I was like, oh, okay. And then right after that, it was like, and Hot Metal Bridge Faith Community is not that important. And I was like, oh, okay. And it wasn't like that you're not doing good work or Hot Metal isn't doing important things, but it was just like, just relax. You're not going to keep I'm God. If God is God, then God will do what God needs to do on the South Side, with or without me, with or without Hot Metal Bridge Faith Community. And one of the things I always said often was like in the community was, God is God, so you don't have to be.
Yeah.
And it's just that kind of reflection, that space of like, oh, let me have a better perspective on this. So Brian, I just want to have one little last part of a conversation before we see if folks want to chime in with any questions. And it's going to be a little bit more around the communal aspect of resilient spiritual practices, developing the way of spiritual fortitude and community. But I did want to mention, just because I think it's important, that some good resilient practices for us revolve around who we're inviting into our lives. So when we're in those spaces that we need it, that therapy is really important spiritual practice, or good mentoring, coaching, spiritual direction, that there are those that we can invite into our space that can journey with us, that help us develop this space of spiritual resilience. And I know all those things were very important to me in my journey. So yeah, any last thoughts on just like kind of your own personal spiritual practices, Brian, or before we talk about this little community talk?
We haven't talked a lot about sort of just this core connection with God. But let me just say, and maybe nobody here even needs to hear this, but I know I needed to hear it, and I still need to hear it from time to time. And that is this: if you have a sick concept of God, the more devoted you are, the worse off you'll be. And sometimes what we have to say is, my concept of God that I'm deeply devoted to is faulty. It's not working. The God whenever I say I need to be more spiritual and spend more time in prayer, the God that I'm praying to, the God that I understand to be there in my brain that I'm praying to, is cruel or unforgiving or ungracious or unrealistically demanding. And one of the things that I think that challenge was a challenge to me in my 24 years of pastoral ministry, and has been since, is this: that every one of us has to give ourselves permission to be a growing Christian. And part of being a growing Christian is saying, my theology is changing. Things I thought about God 5 years ago, I don't think are so true anymore. And that's changing. And sometimes it's a very hard place to be when you're a pastor, because everybody's expecting you to uphold some shared set of understandings of God, or they expect you to have it all together, or you expect yourself to have it all together. And one of the great benefits of spiritual direction and mentoring is if you can be with somebody who every once in a while will just give you permission to say, you're allowed to say, I don't know. You're allowed to say, I'm not sure. You're allowed to have doubts of old ideas. And for if that's of help to anybody today, I just thought that would be worth sharing before we move on. Does that make sense to you, Jeff?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's definitely part of my story and part of my journey, and the permission to allow ourselves to enter into those spaces theologically, and that's why I have doubt and faith as one of the conversations that we're going to have later in the series with Jonathan Tran. Like, we can doubt what does it mean to press into that space. And I know for me, Brian, there's one spiritual exercise from St. Ignatius where he invites you to sit at the foot of the crucified Jesus, at the foot of the cross, and to gaze upon Jesus in his crucifixion, and to ask these three questions: what have I done for Christ? What am I doing for Christ? What will I do for Christ? Well, as I encountered that meditation in my journey with the spiritual exercises, I hated it. It's a terrible meditation, because all it's inspiring is like guilt and shame, and like, what have I done? Well, not enough. What am I doing? I don't know, day to day. What will I do? I don't know. I'll make some promises I probably won't keep. So I had to reframe that whole thing into a different, like, sitting there, but asking different questions. Asking, who have I been in Christ? Who am I in Christ? Who am I becoming in Christ?
That's beautiful.
And it's a whole different orientation.
Yes.
And to your point of like that theological transformation, the ways who I was in Christ is different from who I am in Christ. Yes. And Lord willing, who I'm becoming in Christ will be different for who I am in Christ now. So that was a helpful reframing for me, to not make it so much about all the doing, but again, this connection to our being in Christ. And so let's just have this last little conversation around community. And this was, I wanted to add this on just because I've been reading this book by Barbara Holmes. It's her latest book called Crisis Contemplation: Healing the Wounded Village. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And Barbara, I'm sure many of you know her. She's connected along with Brian through the Center Action and Contemplation, and has written some other wonderful books around contemplation. And she says in the book, she references the African proverb of "it takes a village to raise a child," but then she also says, "and it takes a village to survive." And so what does it mean for us to think in terms of our spiritual resilience, fortitude with our village, Brian? Like, to do this in community, are there certain practices that help us more communally than just, we've been kind of talking very individually?
Well, first, I'm really glad you bring up Barbara's book. And, one of the things that Barbara does as an African-American woman is she looks back at the resilience of her ancestors, who were the Gullah people in the southeast coast of the United States, who were enslaved. And she had enslaved relatives in Maryland. And many of you may know that Maryland was a particularly horrible place to be a slave, because at some point, Maryland began exporting slaves, which meant that the women, if I can, there's just no easy way to say this, but they were raped as a business practice to produce children to be sold as slaves. So horrible, realities. And she has thought long and hard about how her ancestors survived and what remnants she sees of those practices, even several generations later, among her in her extended family. And of course, ironically, one of the things that you see when you look at people who have survived enormous oppression is they almost always have extraordinary counterintuitive practices of celebration. And super important, for us to figure that out, I think, and to face that really makes a lot of sense. And that celebration is a communal kind of celebration. It's people getting together and having parties and meals and feasts and and singing and whatever these different practices might be. So I think that
she calls it in the book performing joy, joy, because as she highlights, because as we talk about this need for the spiritual fortitude in our communities, of course, in marginalized, oppressed communities, there is a generational trauma that is passed down, that is through epigenetics, like in the genes itself. There's Dr. Joy DeGruy, who wrote about the post-traumatic slave syndrome. And so she talks about practices of crisis contemplation. And one of them is what you said, performing joy. But she also talks about lament and the importance of lament in community, and the importance of like art as a part of that process as well. So it's just a really it's something for us to obviously to keep reflecting upon, and to consider how do we need to incorporate these practices into our communal space as well as our personal space. Any other thoughts on that, Brian?
Well, I'll just say one of our problems in our denominational life is that very often the people who are your colleagues or peers in ministry, those are utilitarian relationships in some ways. And one of the things I think we need in those communal spaces is we need some spaces where we have the freedom to be absolutely, as honest as we need to be and as honest as we can be. Knowing that the people who hear us will not use that against us. And to find a couple of friends with whom you can have that kind of transparency. And again, not the forced transparency of each other's interrogators, but it's the freedom to know I'm with people who love me and accept me and understand me, want the best for me, and who will tell me if they think I'm BSing them or whatever. This just becomes really important. And what that I think, and I bet a lot of folks on this call have done this already, but that might mean 3 or 4 friends with whom it is worth buying a plane ticket to get together once a year for a couple of days. Just, for 5 years, it might just be a fun time. You don't need it. But on the 6th year, you might be the one who needs that to survive. And so, and I've been blessed with those kinds of friendships. And in some of those pastors' meetings where you and I met many years ago, that was one of our purposes, is just to create places where you could be together and take a walk together and maybe, get out. Hey, my wife and I aren't doing so well. I really need to talk to somebody about it. Hey,
Yeah, no
Yeah.
offense, Brian, but I remember nothing that you said from those retreats. But I remember
Yeah.
the connections
Yeah, that's right.
that were made. And again, I think it's, for me, this like Sabbath is such an important word and such an important thing for us to participate in. And communally practicing Sabbath. What I've heard some of the practices from our 1001 leaders is they're starting to do these communal practices of Sabbath, where Sundays where there's months where there's 5 Sundays, the fifth Sunday is off. We don't do church. Everybody gets off, right? And one community took all of August off, and they kind of structured it. They said, hey, here's some things. Here are ways you can engage. You don't have to stop engaging, but like we're kind of taking the month off. And another community, I talked to a pastor, they take Advent off. Can you believe it? The humanity to take Advent off and to give your people space during a season. And again, they have certain structure and rhythm to it. So I think we need to like rethink what it means to care for ourselves and help our communities also to be like, yeah, you know what? Let's just hit pause. It's okay. It's okay to do that. And just I'll note to everybody, and then I'll open it up, see if anybody has questions or if you want to have some conversation. But I've put together something I call Practicing Sabbath Toolkit that I'm going to be sending out to everybody that registered to this. And it's a way of helping you reflect on your own personal Sabbath practice. And there's a little bit of like thinking about who you're gathering around you, as Brian has been highlighting as part of that, and helping you also think about how you might better practice Sabbath. What are some things you can do to build rhythms daily, weekly, quarterly, yearly into your life? So it's just a little toolkit that I hope will be of some help to you as you try to evaluate where you are in your own practice and think about how you want to build that kind of practice and that rhythm into your life. So I'll be sending that out. And also, if you signed up on the Whova platform, it is also attached there, and you can resource it there. So, friends, you have any questions or anything you want to either drop in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and we can call on you and invite you into anything you'd like, any reflections, any questions. Obviously, it's kind of open to anything. I can't see hands up. I should, you see any hands up, Molly?
Not yet.
Okay. Give it another minute.
But I'm looking. There's a lot of people on the screens.
Yeah, usually they pop up.
Oh, there's a question in the chat here.
Brian, what is your next book and why?
Oh, thanks, Bob. So my next book is called Do I Stay Christian? So as you can imagine, the why part of that's a big deal. But a short answer is that I think, in fact, this is super relevant to this discussion. You know, whoever is a pastor at whatever point in history, there are things going on in their point of history. And we're at a point in history in the United States when Christianity is doing some nefarious things in some of its forms. And we're coming to terms with an American history that is so deeply embedded with racism and that white supremacy has been the standard operating procedure in which all of American Christianity has had to be conducted, or has been conducted. And we're trying to break out of that. And we're at this long period. Well, there's so much we could say. And we happen to be at this period when Fox News and social media have created a polarization in the country such that it doesn't matter what you say as the pastor. If you disagree with Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham, you are wrong, and you are now hated by that member of your congregation because their loyalty is far greater to Fox News than it is to First Presbyterian. that's not your fault. That's the reality. And with all of that going on, there's just that makes our work so much more difficult. Yeah, so much we could say about that. And so the challenge we have during a period of what Diana Butler Bass has called religious recession, that adds stress, that adds challenge to all of our lives. And I think it becomes important for us to just acknowledge that. But that reality is what's behind this book. So the book has 3 parts. The first part is called No, the second part is called Yes, and the third part is called How. So the first part is the 10 best reasons I know of not to stay a Christian, and to break up with Christianity. And then the second part is are there reasons to stay Christian facing those first 10? And then the last part is whether or not you're going to stay a Christian, how are you going to live? So yeah, that's the project I've been working on.
When will that be available, Brian? Do you know?
That comes out in May, end of May.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks. I see Cindy has her hand up. Go ahead, Cindy.
I was trying to think of how to phrase this, because we've talked a lot about self-care and we've talked a lot about Sabbath, and then that community connection. So there's a lot of course, grief and mourning, loss going on in the congregations everywhere that I know of, and a lot of anxiety that things are just not going to be good. And as the pastor, you tend to be kind of the lightning rod for that people will diffuse their anxiety on you. What do you do with that? Any thoughts?
Gosh, Cindy, thanks for asking that. Tell me if this resonates with you, Cindy, but when things aren't going well, both pastors and congregations tend to blame themselves. If that doesn't work, they tend to blame each other. And so everybody ends up with all of this blame and shame, which just adds more stress, which just makes the whole thing less fun. And it feels like if a counselor were to try to counsel our congregation as a corporate person, the counselor might say, look, we've got to go through those stages of denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance. We've got to go through some stages where we break through our denial. And I think the denial is the stage that is most exhausting. It's so exhausting to think we were like this in the 1950s. We could be like this again. No, it's not going to happen. And for us to be able to say, we're in this situation and a whole bunch of things are changing, and our job is to not get back to the 1950s or 1980s. Why anybody would pick either of those 2 decades, I don't know. But our job is not to get back. Our job is to face reality. And reality includes the possibilities of what could come out of this. But it's almost as if I think we're going to continue to be exhausted, and we're going to continue blaming each other until we're able to get past that denial. And then we'll look at each other maybe with a renewed appreciation and say, well, we're in this together. We've got each other. What can we make of this situation? I don't know. That doesn't solve the problem, but I think it maybe stops the hemorrhaging that comes from blaming and accepting blame.
And I'd say, Brian, not even the 50s or the 80s now. It's like 18 months ago. Let's get back to what we were doing 18 months ago.
Yes, that's so true.
Should we be getting back to that? And so
Yes.
I've seen a lot of stress, Cindy, on leaders that are navigating that space of saying, hey, we're going to go do all the old things, right? Where actually some new things have been healthy and good. And yeah, so it's really challenging. I think the things I've said at times is one, that there's a lot of surrender we have to do certainly around people that aren't going to show back up, that are gone, and we have to be okay with that. But I've also heard of how, like, some people have entered into community because of the COVID situation and because of now being able to be online. And so, one of my, I hope, resilient practices is, I had a therapist once tell me, like, gather the grace. What's the grace? What's happening? I know lots happening around you, but where can you gather the grace as well? Is there another hand? Sharon.
Hey, Jeff, long time no see.
Hey, yeah.
Hey, thank you very much, Brian and Jeff, for this wonderful opportunity to share in your words of wisdom. I'm curious about, I appreciated your talking about vulnerability along with shame and blaming. I'm wondering, how do you develop a culture in your church where people feel safe in their own guilt and shame? That so many people have family system issues or history of racism and thinking that has been destructive. And I'm just wondering, where have you seen a way to develop a culture of authenticity that is safe?
Hey, Sharon, I don't mean to put you on the spot because you're, asking a really good question, but I wonder, could you talk about what you see? Because it sounds like you're feeling that. I just wonder, what does it look like? What would it look like to you to see more of that?
I feel like in people's brokenness, there's so much anger, or and they project that to other people.
Yeah.
And instead of working through their own family systems, they lash out at others, or they go back to history. And I guess I don't have too much specific examples, except for particular examples, except for I just sense a lot of shame in people.
Yes.
Coming out of COVID, there's people have had time to think. They've spent a lot of time in isolation. And the way I've been trying to work through it is developing small groups, an opportunity for Bible study and things like that. But some people run away from that because they don't want to be vulnerable.
Yeah. I hear you saying too, that there are some people that if you put them in a group, they'll blow it up because they just have too much garbage going on or stress going on. That if you put them in a group, it doesn't matter how good the rest of the people in the group are, one person can blow it up. That's certainly been my experience.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that we have enough dysfunction in the system right now, from politics and Facebook and conspiracy theories and all the stuff that's going on, that we're going to need to reinstitute really carefully thought out ground rules for a lot of our conversations and groups again.
That's very helpful. So some best practices or some ways of guidelines of being together.
Yeah. And it's probably going to mean resharpening some of our own school tools in this. So I'll just give you an example, because I'm working with the Living School. The Living School has, a set of rules for what they call circle groups, guidelines or ground rules, whatever. But so one of them is to listen from the heart, to speak from the heart, to be lean of expression, and no fixing, right? So the leader of the group has to promise everybody at the beginning of the first, several meetings, that if the leader has to say something like, if I hear you doing some fixing of someone, if someone speaks and you start fixing, I promise it's my responsibility. I will stop you before it goes too far. And if you're not being lean of expression, I will try to interrupt you and remind you to get to the point. Don't be offended. I'm just doing my job. And you set that up, and then people then can experience the benefits of the freedom, of the opportunity. Yeah.
I think that's very helpful. I'm seeing that a lot of people are carrying deep shame.
Yeah.
That's what I'm picking up in my conversations. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharon.
You're a good pastor,
Carlos.
Sharon.
Sharon is a good pastor, Brian. I guarantee that. Carlos, Please
Thank
share.
you, Jeff. Brian, you mentioned something, I'm paraphrasing here, but you said something like, to the extent that we have an erroneous image of God and we have a devotion to that erroneous image of God, to that extent we will suffer. What I took a history of Christianity class, and it seems that the gospel from Jerusalem through Paul's missionary journeys, when it got to Rome and Constantine took over Christianity in the year 300, from the year 300 through the year now, it seems like Christianity has been spread by the sword. When the Europeans, specifically the Spaniards, reached Latin America, Montezuma was offered communion on the end of a spear, and it was said to him, convert or die. And it seems this image has been perpetuated. What do you recommend? What sources can we go to confront the atrocities that have been perpetuated under the name of Christ? Because there was no love shown to Montezuma the way the gospel showed the love of Christ during the first 300 years, specifically Jerusalem.
Yes. Oh, Carlos, such an important question. So actually, Carlos, a lot of what you just said is what my next book is about. But I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Great Spiritual Migration, where I try to talk about some of this. And many of you are maybe familiar with this, but this is another thing you could just Google, the doctrine of discovery. And you'll find a papal encyclical that came out in 1452. And this papal encyclical literally said to the kings of Europe, go into all the world and make slaves of the nations, steal their goods, bring to yourself their goods and their labor. And this was a papal command. Encyclical wasn't the right word, but it was a papal letter. It's called a bull. And of course, this unleashed centuries and centuries of heartache that the Christian religion has either kept a secret or just been ignorant of. And once you understand it, I think you start seeing. And so that story of Montezuma, we just realize is repeated 1,000 times over. And I think this is maybe going back to Sharon's point about shame and stress. It may well be that there is stress in the system until we acknowledge these realities and let them flush out. And so in one sense, there will be no health for our system until we face these realities of our history. And at the end of the day, I think that will require us to say, what was in our concept of God that allowed those atrocities to be done century after century? And maybe it's time for us to have, well, not maybe, it is certainly time for us to rethink our understanding of God. I actually think not only does the future of Christianity depend on this, but I think the future of the world depends on it, because the world cannot survive 500 more years of Christian domination of the kind we've seen for the last 500. So yeah, this is really important. And it's relevant to this subject of, pastoral health and the way of fortitude, because if this is in the system and we're finding it difficult to keep the system going, maybe, maybe this is a factor of our fatigue. And it's not supposed to work until we can have these needed breakthroughs that you speak of, Carlos.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Brian. So any one last word? Any one last question or last hand before we retire for the evening? Well, Brian, I thank you so much for being with us. I thank you for helping us think hopefully more holistically just about our own space of caring for ourselves. I hope we can begin to learn how to be a friend to ourselves, that in order that we might be able to follow Jesus really more faithfully in how we love others. So love to just close us with a poem from the Sufic mystic Hafiz, who I really enjoy. And I find in this poem called "We Have Not Come to Take Prisoners," an invitation to kind of joy and delight in the abundant life that Jesus is inviting us to, because I know Jesus wants us to find joy and delight in this life and in our ministry, even as it's so challenging and difficult. And before I do read that, I do want to highlight next week, talking with Therese Taylor Stinson. Therese, are you still here? Is Therese here? Therese may have.
I'm here.
Therese, can you just say hello?
Hello, everyone. Looking forward to talking with you next week
Therese,
on contemplative spirituality.
Yes, I'm so looking forward to the conversation with Therese. She's wonderful, beautiful soul, and we're going to go deep dive into our contemplative space. So thanks for being here tonight, Therese, and look forward to the conversation next week with you.
I enjoyed your talk, Brian.
Thank you, Therese. I'm so glad to be with you tonight.
Thank you.
So let me just offer this as our prayer as we get ready to leave each other. We have not come here to take prisoners, but to surrender ever more deeply to freedom and joy. We have not come into this exquisite world to hold ourselves hostage from love. Run, my dear, from anything that may not strengthen your precious budding wings. Run like hell, my dear, from anyone likely to put a sharp knife into the sacred, tender vision of your beautiful heart. We have a duty to befriend those aspects of obedience that stand outside of our house and shout to our reason, oh please, come out and play. For we have not come here to take prisoners or to confine our wondrous spirits, but to experience ever and ever more deeply our divine courage, freedom, and light. Friends, I pray that you can experience more deeply your own divine freedom, courage, and light this week. And I invite you all now to go in peace. Thanks for being with us. Thank you, Brian. Peace be with you, everyone.
And also with you.
Thanks, Therese.